You know, there's a peace that settles deep in your bones when you've lived on the same stretch of land your entire life, land that your grandparents carved out of sheer grit and hope. Blackwood Creek Ranch wasn't just property to me, it was a living, breathing testament to family, to endurance, to a way of life that's vanishing faster than a creek in a drought. 300 acres of rolling hills, ancient oaks that had seen more history than any textbook, and the eponymous Blackwood Creek meandering through it, a silver ribbon tying it all together. My days were measured by the sun and the seasons, the lowing of my small herd of cattle, the whicker of my horses in the misty dawn. It was a good life, a hard life sometimes, but always an honest one. Then came Whispering Pines Estates. It started a few years back, a new housing development sprouting like aggressive weeds on the far side of Miller's Ridge, barely visible from my main pastures. At first, it was just a distant hum of construction, then a few too many pristine SUVs kicking up dust on the county road. I figured, live and let live. My ranch was my world, their cul-de-sacs were theirs. I had the original deeds, ironclad water rights, and fences that had stood for generations. What could they possibly want with me? The first hint of trouble was small, almost laughable. A glossy pamphlet left tucked into my mailbox, which was a good quarter-mile from my actual house, inviting me to a community welcome barbecue for Whispering Pines residents. It mentioned neighborhood standards and aesthetic harmony. I remember chuckling, tossing it onto the pile of junk mail. Aesthetic harmony. My tractors were probably older than most of their houses, and my idea of landscaping involved whatever the deer didn't eat. I was polite, though. When I'd see one of them in town, usually looking a bit lost in the feed store, I'd nod. Some nodded back. Most just seemed out of place, like they'd taken a wrong turn on the way to the golf course. Little did I know, that glossy pamphlet wasn't an invitation, it was a warning shot. A very polite, pastel-colored warning shot, but a warning shot nonetheless. The real overture from the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association arrived on a Tuesday, tucked inside a crisp, annoyingly high-quality envelope. I'd just come in from mending a fence line down by the creek, a job that always left me feeling a satisfying kind of tired. Covered in mud, smelling faintly of horse and honest sweat, I slit open the envelope with my pocket knife. Inside, a letter, printed on heavy bond paper with an embossed logo of a stylized, perfectly symmetrical pine tree. It informed me, in no uncertain terms, that I was in violation of Whispering Pines HOA covenants, conditions and restrictions, specifically Section 4, Subsection B, Paragraph 3, Maintenance of Unsightly Property. It included a fine of $200, due within 30 days. Unsightly property. I looked out my kitchen window. I saw my rambling, beloved, slightly chaotic ranch, the weathered barn, the corral that needed a new coat of paint but was perfectly functional, the fields greening up for spring. This was my life, my livelihood. It wasn't a show home. I stomped the mud off my boots and picked up the phone. The number connected to an automated system, then, after a series of button presses that tested my already frail patience, to a woman with a voice so smooth it sounded like it had been buffed with silk. I explained the letter. She transferred me to a Mr. Alastair Finch, president of the Whispering Pines HOA. His voice, when it finally came on the line, was the human equivalent of that embossed logo, stiff, overly formal, and radiating an unearned sense of superiority. "Ms. Blackwood," he began, his tone suggesting I was a particularly tiresome insect he'd found crawling on his perfectly manicured lawn. "The letter is quite clear. Your property, particularly the frontage visible from the access road leading to Phase C of our development, is, shall we say, not in keeping with community standards Phase C." That was miles away, barely a glint of rooftops if you squinted from my highest pasture on a clear day. "Mr. Finch," I said, trying to keep my voice even, "my ranch has been here for 70 years. It's a working ranch, not a decorative garden. And frankly, it's none of your HOA's business what my property looks like, especially since I'm not a member of your association and my land isn't part of your development." He chuckled, a dry, papery sound. "Ah, but that's where you're mistaken, Miss Blackwood. The aesthetic integrity of the surrounding area directly impacts the property values within Whispering Pines. Our residents have made significant investments. We have a duty to protect those investments." I could almost hear him preening through the phone. This wasn't about aesthetics, it was about control, about a certain kind of person wanting to bulldoze anything that didn't fit their narrow, sanitized vision of the world. The conversation went downhill from there. He was condescending, I was indignant. He threatened further fines. I threatened to send my bull, Ferdinand, over to discuss aesthetic harmony with his petunias. We ended the call with nothing resolved, just a simmering anger on my part and, I suspected, a smug sense of power on his. That fine was just the beginning. I decided a face-to-face was in order. Maybe if this Finch character saw I wasn't some faceless name on a tax roll, but a real person working real land, he'd back off. The HOA office, according to their fancy letterhead, was in a small, generic-looking commercial strip mall on the edge of town, the kind with a discount shoe store and a vape shop. It wasn't exactly exuding luxury or power. The office itself was tiny, 2 rooms separated by a flimsy partition. A bored-looking woman sat at a cheap desk in the front, typing with 2 fingers. She pointed me towards a closed door marked President Finch. When he emerged, was exactly as I'd pictured, mid-50s, thinning hair slicked back with too much product, a suit that looked expensive but didn't quite fit his paunch, and a Windsor not tight enough to cut off circulation to a lesser man's brain. He had small, shrewd eyes that scanned me up and down, clearly unimpressed by my clean jeans and practical flannel shirt. "Miss Blackwood," he said, not offering a hand. "To what do I owe the surprise?" I laid the fine notice on his desk. "I came to talk about this absurdity, Mr. Finch. And to tell you, in person, that your HOA has no jurisdiction over my ranch." He picked up the notice, glanced at it as if it were a soiled handkerchief. "Jurisdiction, Miss Blackwood, can be a flexible concept when community welfare is at stake. Your rustic charm," he said, the word rustic like it was a contagious disease, "is becoming a point of contention among our residents." "We've had numerous complaints." I raised an eyebrow. "Complaints? From people who chose to buy houses next to a long-established agricultural operation. What did they expect, a theme park?" He leaned back, steepling his fingers. "They expect a certain standard, Miss Blackwood. Property values are paramount. We've already received a petition regarding the aroma from your cattle, especially on warm days. And the visual pollution of your old fences and outbuildings." My jaw tightened. Aroma. Visual pollution. This is prime ranch land, Finch. It's what this valley used to be before places like Whispering Pines started paving it over. The discussion, if you could call it that, grew more heated. He produced a new list of demands. I was to paint my barn a neutral earth tone, approved by their architectural committee, replace my barbed wire fences along the road with more aesthetically pleasing wooden ones, at my expense, naturally, and even limit the times my cattle could be in the pasture nearest their development. Each demand was more ludicrous than the last. He even had the gall to suggest that perhaps my ranch was no longer economically viable, and that I should consider alternative uses for the land, gesturing vaguely towards a map of Whispering Pines' planned future phases, which seemed to creep ominously closer to my property lines. It was clear he saw my ranch not as a legacy, but as an obstacle, an unsightly blemish on his pristine suburban dream. I left that office fuming, the list of demands crumpled in my fist. This wasn't just about a fine anymore. This was a siege. Back at the ranch, the anger began to cool, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. These people, with their manicured lawns and their manufactured outrage, weren't going to bully me off my land or dictate how I lived on it. My grandfather, Joseph Blackwood, had been a tough, shrewd man. He'd fought tooth and nail for this ranch, battled droughts, market crashes, and even a couple of unscrupulous land speculators back in the day. He'd taught me to stand my ground, to know my rights, and to never, ever let anyone push me around when I was in the right. So, I did what Grandpa Joe would have done. I went to the old roll-top desk in his study, a room I'd kept largely as he'd left it. I pulled out the heavy metal lockbox where he kept all the important papers. Inside, nestled amongst old photographs and yellowed newspaper clippings, were the original deeds to Blackwood Creek Ranch, beautifully calligraphed documents dating back to the late 1940s. There were surveyors' maps, water rights agreements meticulously drafted by a country lawyer long since passed, even records of boundary disputes settled decades ago in my family's favor. I spent hours poring over them, tracing the lines, reading the legal jargon. My property lines were clear, unassailable. The access road Finch had mentioned, the one leading to his precious Phase C, actually ran along an old county easement, and my grandfather had made sure there was a clause specifying no new developments could impede agricultural access or use. A small smile touched my lips. Grandpa Joe had been thinking ahead, even then. I cross-referenced everything with the current county plat maps online. No discrepancies. My ranch was a fortress, legally speaking. I even found a file detailing how Grandpa Joe had successfully fought off a similar attempt by a different developer in the 70s who wanted to run a sewer line straight through our best pasture. He'd known his stuff. Armed with this knowledge, I drafted a polite but firm letter to Mr. Finch and the Whispering Pines HOA. I cited the specific deeds, the easement clauses, and respectfully informed him that his association had zero authority over my property. I also pointed out that their complaints about aroma were frivolous, given the agricultural zoning of my land which predated their entire development by half a century. I sent it certified mail, return receipt requested. For a few weeks, there was silence. The fines stopped. I almost allowed myself to hope that Finch had seen reason, or perhaps his lawyer had advised him he was on shaky ground. The quiet was deceptive. It was the calm before a much bigger storm. The storm broke on a blustery March morning. Another crisp envelope from Whispering Pines, but this one felt heavier, more ominous. It wasn't from Finch, it was from a law firm, Snodgrass, Grimsby, and Thwaite, a name that sounded like it belonged to a trio of Dickensian villains. My heart sank a little. Lawyers meant things were serious. The letter was dense with legalese, but the gist was horrifyingly clear. The Whispering Pines HOA, on behalf of its residents, was formally petitioning the county to rezone a 20-foot wide strip of my land along the entire border shared with their development. They wanted to designate it as a public access greenbelt and utility corridor. They claimed it was for the greater good of the community, allowing for a walking trail, aesthetically pleasing landscaping to buffer their sensitive residents from the site of my ranch, and, conveniently, access for future utility expansion for Whispering Pines. They weren't just trying to fine me into submission anymore, they were trying to take my land. 20 feet along a nearly mile-long border, that was acres. Acres of good pasture, acres that held the fence line my grandfather had built, acres that were indisputably mine. The letter ended with a thinly veiled threat: cooperate, and they might offer a nominal sum for the inconvenience. Resist, and they would pursue all legal avenues, including, they hinted, potential actions under eminent domain if the county could be persuaded, though how an HOA thought it could wield eminent domain was beyond me. It was a bluff, surely, but a terrifying one. This was it. This was what Finch had been working towards with his nitpicking and his fake complaints. He didn't just want me to paint my barn, he wanted to carve up my ranch, piece by piece, until it was small enough and tame enough not to offend his delicate sensibilities. The phrase, "kick me off my own ranch," wasn't an exaggeration anymore. If they could take this strip, what was to stop them from trying to take more later? My hands were shaking, not with fear, but with a profound, bone-deep fury. This wasn't just land, it was my heritage, my home. My grandfather's sweat and dreams were soaked into this soil. I thought of him, his weathered face, his calloused hands. He'd have met this outrage head-on, with every ounce of fight he possessed. And so would I. This was no longer a squabble over aesthetics. This was war. The initial shock gave way to a cold, clear anger. These people, these interlopers with their brand new houses and their entitlement, thought they could just waltz in and dismantle a legacy. They had another think coming. My first call was to Martha Jenkins, a retired lawyer friend of my mom's who lived down in the valley. Martha was sharp as a tack and had a healthy disrespect for bullies. I explained the situation, read her the key phrases from the lawyer's letter. She listened patiently, punctuating my story with indignant snorts. A green belt, you say? To buffer them from a working ranch they knowingly built next to. The audacity, she clucked. Sarah, this stinks to high heaven. They're trying to intimidate you, pure and simple. An HOA doesn't have eminent domain powers, not unless they've somehow bought off the entire county commission, which isn't impossible but highly unlikely for a strip of your land. Her practical advice was a balm to my frayed nerves. She suggested I immediately file a formal objection with the county planning department, which I did first thing the next morning. Then she said something that really stuck with me: don't just play defense, Sarah. These types always assume the farmer is just going to roll over. Find out who this Finch character really is. Who's on his board? What are their weaknesses? Sometimes the best defense is a good offense, her words echoed in my mind. For weeks, I'd been reacting to their attacks. It was time to go on the offensive. It was time to turn the tables. I started with Alastair Finch. A little online digging revealed he wasn't some titan of industry. He was a former mid-level manager at a regional bank who'd taken an early retirement package, usually a polite term for being pushed out. He'd then dabbled in real estate development with a couple of small, unsuccessful projects before landing the role of Whispering Pines' HOA president, a position that probably gave him the sense of power he craved. The other board members were a mixed bag, a couple of retirees who likely just wanted a quiet life and probably got railroaded by Finch, a dentist with an overly inflated sense of his own importance, and a woman who listed her occupation as social media influencer, specializing in aspirational suburban living. None of them seemed like master strategists. Then, I turned my attention to the HOA itself. I went down to the county records office, a place I was becoming increasingly familiar with. I requested the incorporation documents for the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. It was all public record. Standard stuff, mostly. But one detail caught my eye: the official registered address for the HOA, the one they used for all their legal filings. It was the same address as their little office in that rundown strip mall, Unit 4B, 112 Commerce Street. Something about that address niggled at the back of my mind. That address, Unit 4B, 112 Commerce Street. Why did it feel familiar? I'm on my ranch most days, not exactly keeping tabs on strip mall unit numbers. But there was something, a faint echo. I pushed it aside for a moment, focusing on Finch and his crew. I attended a public county commission meeting where they were scheduled to present their Greenbelt proposal. Finch was in his element, pontificating about community benefit and visual harmony, showing glossy artists' renderings of a pristine pathway lined with perfectly spaced, non-native shrubs, conveniently obscuring any view of my unsightly barns. I spoke too, calmly and clearly, presenting my deeds, the history of my ranch, and the agricultural zoning that had been in place for decades. I pointed out the disingenuous nature of their claims, how they were trying to seize private property for what amounted to a private beautification project for their exclusive development. Some of the commissioners looked sympathetic. Others looked like they were already calculating campaign donations. It was going to be a fight. Back home, that evening, exhausted and frustrated, I was idly sorting through a box of old tax documents, looking for something unrelated. My eyes landed on a file labeled Commercial Holdings, Grandpa Joe. Curiosity piqued. I opened it. Inside were papers relating to a few small investments my grandfather had made over the years, mostly small-town stuff. And then I saw it. A lease agreement, decades old, for a property at 112 Commerce Street. My heart gave a lurch. I scanned further. Grandpa Joe, under a small company he'd set up called Creekbend Properties LLC, had bought that entire little strip mall back in the late 70s. It was considered a bit out of the way then, but he'd gotten it for a song, figuring the town would grow towards it eventually. He was right, as usual. I flipped through more pages, property tax statements for 112 Commerce Street, addressed to Creekbend Properties LLC. Insurance policies. Maintenance receipts. And then, the current articles of incorporation for Creekbend Properties LLC. After Grandpa Joe passed, my father had managed it, and after him, the responsibility, along with the shares held in the Blackwood Family Trust, had passed to me. I was the primary trustee. I owned Creekbend Properties LLC. I owned the building that housed the Whispering Pines HOA office. A slow grin spread across my face. The sheer, unadulterated, poetic justice of it was almost too beautiful to comprehend. Alastair Finch, the man trying to bully me, to take my land, to tell me how to live, was paying rent to me. He was plotting my ranch's demise from an office that I, Sarah Blackwood, effectively owned. Oh, this was going to be good. This was going to be very, very good. The first thing I did was try not to laugh out loud like a madwoman. The irony was so thick you could spread it on toast. Alastair Finch, with all his pompous pronouncements and legal threats, was operating out of my building. My grandfather, bless his far-sighted, business-savvy soul, had unknowingly handed me the perfect weapon. I spent the next hour digging through the Creekbend Properties LLC files with the focus of a hawk spotting a field mouse. There it was, the original lease agreement for Unit 4B, signed 5 years ago by one Alastair Finch on behalf of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. It had been a standard 5-year lease. And, joy of joys, it had expired 3 months ago. They were currently on a month-to-month tenancy. My grin widened. Month to month. That meant I could give them 30 days notice to vacate. Or, even better, I could renegotiate the terms. Drastically. I pulled out their own CC and RS, the ones they were so fond of waving in my face. I remembered Martha Jenkins' advice, find their weaknesses. Well, I'd found a big one. I also found a clause in their lease agreement with Creekbend Properties that I'd previously overlooked because, frankly, managing that sleepy little LLC was low on my priority list. Clause 17, tenant shall not engage in any activity on or from the leased premises that constitutes a nuisance or unreasonably interferes with the quiet enjoyment of neighboring properties. Well. Harassing a neighboring property owner, namely, me and Blackwood Creek Ranch, with frivolous lawsuits, threats, and attempts to seize land. If that wasn't unreasonably interfering with quiet enjoyment, I didn't know what was. They were in breach. Finch was in breach of the lease he'd signed for the very office from which he was launching his attacks. The beauty of it was almost overwhelming. The next morning, I called Martha Jenkins. Martha, I said, trying to keep the glee out of my voice, you are not going to believe this. I laid it all out. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, then Martha let out a whoop of laughter so loud I had to pull the phone away from my ear. Sarah Blackwood, your grandpa was a genius, she crowed. This is better than a Perry Mason episode. So, what's the plan, maestro? We talked it through. Martha confirmed my understanding of the lease terms and the month-to-month situation. She advised me on the proper way to serve notice, if it came to that. But she also agreed that the leverage was immense. I didn't necessarily want to evict them right away, though the thought was tempting. No, I wanted to see Finch's face when he realized who his landlord was. I wanted to watch his arrogant little empire crumble from within. The plan began to form, elegant in its simplicity, devastating in its potential impact. While Finch was busy plotting to take my land, I was about to pull the rug, no, the entire foundation, out from under his little HOA kingdom. The county commission meeting to decide on the rezoning petition for my land was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Finch and his legal eagles from Snodgrass, Grimsby, and Thwaite would be there in full force, expecting to steamroll me with their community benefit arguments. Little did they know, I had an ace up my sleeve bigger than Texas. In the days leading up to it, I had my lawyer, a quiet, methodical man named Mr. Abernathy whom Martha had recommended for this specific type of confrontation, draft 2 documents. The first was a formal notice of lease violation to Whispering Pines HOA, citing Clause 17, detailing their campaign of harassment against Blackwood Creek Ranch as a clear breach. It gave them 7 days to cease all such activities and issue a formal, written apology, or face immediate termination of their lease for Unit 4B, 112 Commerce Street. The second document was a proposal for a new lease agreement, should they wish to remain. The proposed new rent was, shall we say, significantly higher, about 5 times what they were currently paying. And it included several new clauses, including one that explicitly forbade any HOA member, officer, or agent from harassing, threatening, or taking any legal or administrative action against Blackwood Creek Ranch or its owner, under penalty of immediate eviction and substantial financial damages. It was, if I did say so myself, a masterpiece of polite, legally binding revenge. Mr. Abernathy had a small, almost imperceptible smile when he reviewed it. On the morning of the commission meeting, I felt a calm I hadn't experienced in months. The anger was still there, a cold ember, but it was overlaid with a delicious sense of anticipation. I dressed neatly, not in my usual ranch attire, but not in a power suit either. Just a sensible blouse and slacks. I wanted to look like the reasonable landowner I was, the one being unfairly targeted. The commission chamber was packed. The Whispering Pines contingent was out in force, a sea of pastel polo shirts and anxious, entitled faces. Finch was at the front, looking smug, whispering conspiratorially with his lawyer, Mr. Grimsby, a man whose jowls seemed to quiver with self-importance. They presented their case first. Finch, with a voice dripping theatrical concern, spoke of safety, of community, of the blight that my ranch supposedly represented to their idyllic suburban dream. Grimsby followed with a dry recitation of legal precedents that he claimed supported their petition, conveniently ignoring all the ones that didn't. When it was my turn, I simply walked to the podium. I didn't have glossy renderings or a team of lawyers. I just had the truth, and my 2 carefully prepared documents. I began by reiterating my family's long history on the land, the agricultural zoning, and the lack of any genuine public need for this green belt. I pointed out the absurdity of claiming a working ranch was a nuisance when they had all bought their properties fully aware of its existence. The commissioners listened, some nodding, others looking noncommittal. Finch smirked, clearly believing this was just the futile protest of a soon-to-be-defeated opponent. Then, I changed tack. Commissioners, I said, my voice calm and steady, while the matter of this rezoning petition is before you, there's another, rather pertinent piece of information regarding the petitioner, the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association, and its president, Mr. Alastair Finch, that I believe is relevant to their standing and credibility in this community. A murmur went through the room. Finch's smirk wavered slightly. He exchanged a nervous glance with Grimsby. You see, I continued, Mr. Finch and the Whispering Pines HOA have been operating under the assumption that they can act with impunity, that they can harass landowners and attempt to seize private property without consequence. They've based their campaign against my ranch, against my family's legacy, from their office at Unit 4B, 112 Commerce Street. I paused, letting the address hang in the air for a moment. It has recently come to my attention, as the beneficial owner of Creekbend Properties LLC, that Creekbend Properties is, in fact, the landlord of that very property. In short, Mr. Finch, your HOA is my tenant. The silence in the chamber was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop on the plush carpet. Finch's face went from smug, to confused, to a truly spectacular shade of pale, then mottled red. His jaw literally dropped. Mr. Grimsby looked like he'd swallowed a lemon whole. I let the moment stretch, enjoying the tableau of utter shock. Then, I held up the first document. And as their landlord, I announced, my voice ringing with newfound authority, I have today served the Whispering Pines HOA with this notice of lease violation, due to their persistent and unreasonable interference with a neighboring property, namely, my ranch. They have 7 days to cease all hostile actions against Blackwood Creek Ranch and issue a full public apology. I then held up the second document. Furthermore, should they wish to continue occupying the premises after rectifying their breach, a new lease agreement will be required. The terms, I assure you, will strongly encourage neighborly behavior and reflect current market realities. I placed both documents gently on the podium. Perhaps, Mr. Finch, I said, looking directly at him, his face now a mask of disbelief and dawning horror, you might want to reconsider the wisdom of antagonizing your landlord. The fallout was immediate and immensely satisfying. Finch looked like he'd been poleaxed. He opened and closed his mouth a few times, but no sound came out. Mr. Grimsby, his lawyer, was frantically whispering in his ear, his own face ashen. The county commissioners were looking back and forth between me and Finch, some with amusement, others with a dawning understanding of the power shift that had just occurred. One of them, a stern-faced woman who ran a hardware store in town and had always struck me as no-nonsense, actually cracked a smile. The carefully constructed facade of the Whispering Pines HOA, their image of righteous community protectors, had shattered. They were revealed as bullies, and now, bullies who were about to be homeless or pay through the nose for their headquarters, all at the whim of the very person they'd been trying to destroy. The chairman of the commission cleared his throat. Well, Ms. Blackwood, he said, a touch of admiration in his voice, that is, quite a development. In light of this, new information regarding the petitioners, operational arrangements, perhaps it would be prudent for the Whispering Pines HOA to withdraw their rezoning petition at this time to, shall we say, focus on more pressing internal matters. Finch, finally finding his voice, croaked, this is an outrage. A conflict of interest. She can't do this. Mr. Abernathy, my lawyer, stepped forward calmly. On the contrary, Mr. Finch. My client is acting entirely within her rights as a property owner and landlord. Your HOA's actions created this situation. Perhaps you should have been more diligent in understanding your lease obligations and, indeed, who you were leasing from. The petition was, of course, hastily withdrawn. Finch and his entourage practically fled the commission chambers, pursued by the snickers and incredulous stares of the audience. The next few days were a blur of activity. The HOA board went into meltdown. I heard whispers that Finch's presidency was hanging by a thread. They had a choice: apologize, cease all harassment, and negotiate a new, very expensive lease with very strict terms, or find new offices on extremely short notice. My terms for the new lease were non-negotiable: a public, written apology to me, to be published in the local paper and on their community website, a binding agreement to never again interfere with Blackwood Creek Ranch in any way, shape, or form, and, of course, the substantially increased rent. And just for good measure, a hefty security deposit. After a week of frantic internal meetings, during which I imagined Finch's authority crumbling like a dry-rotted fence post, a humble delegation from the HOA, minus Finch, who apparently couldn't face me, arrived at Mr. Abernathy's office. They agreed to all my terms. The apology, when it was published, was a masterpiece of groveling. All actions against my ranch ceased immediately. The Whispering Pines HOA is still in Unit 4B, for now. They pay their rent on time, every month. It's a significant new income stream for Creekbend Properties LLC, and by extension, for me. And every time I deposit that check, I can't help but smile. Alastair Finch is no longer president of the HOA. Last I heard, he was trying to sell his house in Whispering Pines, probably to escape the glares of his former constituents who now knew exactly who was responsible for their massively increased HOA dues. Life on Blackwood Creek Ranch returned to its familiar rhythms. The cattle still graze, the creek still murmurs, the old oaks still stand tall. But there's a new sweetness to the piece, a deeper appreciation for the legacy Grandpa Joe left me, not just the land itself, but the foresight and the grit that, in the end, helped me protect it. It just goes to show, you should never underestimate a quiet rancher. And always check who owns your office building before you decide to pick a fight.